My name is Chloe. I'm 34 years old, and until 6 months ago, I thought I had the perfect marriage. 7 years with James, building a life together in Portland. Then I found something on his phone, a text message that unraveled everything. My beautiful home, my loving husband, our future plans, all built on lies. What do you do when you discover your husband has a whole other family in another state? If you're watching this story, comment below where you're tuning in from and hit subscribe to hear how I uncovered my husband's double life and how I fought back. I met James at a charity fundraiser 9 years ago. I was working as a junior real estate agent and he was there representing his company. He had this confidence about him that immediately drew me in. Tall with dark hair and the kindest brown eyes I'd ever seen. When he smiled at me from across the room, I felt like a teenager again. We connected over our shared love of hiking and classic films. He asked for my number that night, and by the following weekend we were having dinner at this little Italian restaurant downtown. The conversation flowed so naturally. He told me about growing up in Chicago, his move to Portland for work, and his dreams of traveling the world. I shared my ambitions in real estate and my close relationship with my parents and sister. After 3 months of dating, we were practically inseparable. James would surprise me with little gifts. Not expensive things, but thoughtful items that showed he was truly listening when I talked. A vintage poster of my favorite movie specialty coffee beans from a local roaster I'd mentioned wanting to try a hiking guide for trails I hadn't explored yet. When he proposed after 8 months together, my friends thought it was fast, but I never had a single doubt. He took me back to that Italian restaurant where we had our first date and had the chef bring out tiramisu with the ring on top. I cried, he cried, and everyone in the restaurant applauded. It felt like a scene from a movie. We married the following spring at my parents' lakeside property. Everything was perfect. Wildflowers everywhere, fairy lights strung between trees, and our closest friends and family surrounding us. We wrote our own vows, and James promised to always be honest, faithful, and my partner in every adventure. I believed every word. After the wedding, we bought a beautiful home in an upscale neighborhood. It needed some work, but we spent weekends painting walls, refinishing hardwood floors, and planting a garden together. Every corner of that house held a memory of us building our life together. Sunday mornings making pancakes in the kitchen, evenings curled up watching old movies in the living room, planning our future sitting on the porch swing. Our life together fell into comfortable routines. Coffee together in the morning before work, texting throughout the day, dinner together most nights when he wasn't traveling. We had inside jokes and could communicate with just a look across a room. Everyone said we were the perfect couple. James's job as a regional sales director meant he traveled frequently. Sometimes he'd be gone for 3 or 4 days at a time to cities across the western states. We managed the distance with daily video calls. He'd walk me through his hotel room showing me the view from his window or complaining about the uncomfortable pillows. I'd give him updates about the house or my work. When he returned, he'd always bring me some small gift from his trip. About 2 years into our marriage, we started trying for a baby. Month after month, we faced disappointment. Tests showed nothing wrong with either of us, just what doctors called unexplained infertility. We discussed IVF but decided to keep trying naturally for a while longer. James was so supportive during this time, holding me when I cried after each negative test, assuring me that we would be parents one way or another. We built a strong friend group together, other couples in similar stages of life, regular game nights, summer barbecues, weekend trips to the coast. I particularly bonded with Amanda and her husband Tim. Amanda became my closest confidant outside of my sister. My career flourished during our marriage. I worked my way up to become one of the top-selling agents at my firm. James never showed a hint of jealousy at my success. Instead, he celebrated every achievement with pride. For our 5th anniversary, he framed my first $1 million listing announcement. We had such clear plans for our future. A family with at least 2 children traveling to Europe for our 10th anniversary, eventually buying a vacation cabin in the mountains and retiring early to spend more time together. Every decision we made was with this shared vision in mind. For our 7th anniversary, we renewed our vows in a private ceremony in our backyard. James surprised me with a new wedding band to go with my original engagement ring. He talked about how marrying me was the best decision he ever made and how excited he was for our next 7 years together. I had no idea that in just 3 weeks I would discover it was all a lie. Looking back now, I can identify the early warning signs I missed. Calls that went straight to voicemail when he was supposedly in meetings. Last-minute changes to his travel schedule. The way he sometimes seemed distracted on our video calls like he was calculating what to say. But when you trust someone completely, you explain these things away. I certainly did. The first real hint that something wasn't right came about 3 months before my discovery. James had been traveling to Phoenix regularly for what he said was a new client account. These trips started following a predictable pattern, then suddenly he began extending them, first by a day, then sometimes by an entire weekend. His explanation was always reasonable. The client needed more time he had to visit additional sites, or he wanted to take advantage of being there to meet with other potential clients in the area. I noticed changes in his behavior around his phone. James had always been open with his devices. We knew each other's passcodes, and it wasn't unusual for one of us to use the other's phone to take photos or look something up. But he suddenly changed his passwords and started keeping his phone face down or in his pocket. When I asked him about it casually, he said it was a new company security policy, but something about his explanation felt off. Then came the incident at Raphael's, our favorite restaurant. We were celebrating a big sale I'd made, and when the server ran his card, it was declined. James looked genuinely confused and quickly provided another card. He explained it away as a possible fraud alert since he'd been traveling, but when I logged into our online banking later that week, I couldn't find any record of a fraud alert or even an attempt to use that card at the restaurant. Around this time, I also noticed unusual withdrawals from our joint checking account. $500 here, $700 there. When I asked about them, James said he was setting aside cash for a surprise anniversary trip. It seemed plausible, but the amounts and frequency felt excessive, even for a nice vacation. The jewelry receipts were harder to explain. I was looking for a receipt for a business expense in his home office when I found a receipt for a sapphire pendant from a high-end jewelry store in Phoenix. My birthday had passed months ago, and our anniversary was still months away. I never received that pendant or any other piece of jewelry that matched the description. When I questioned him about these financial discrepancies, James became uncharacteristically defensive. He accused me of not trusting him and turned the conversation around to make me feel like I was being unreasonable. This reaction was so unlike him that it actually worried me more than the discrepancies themselves. One night, his phone rang around 2 a.m. He grabbed it quickly and took the call outside on our back deck. Through the window, I could see his intense expression as he spoke in hushed tones. When he came back to bed, he claimed it was a co-worker in a different time zone who had an emergency with a client presentation. He rolled over and went back to sleep as if nothing unusual had happened while I lay awake staring at the ceiling. I also began noticing how James was creating distance between me and his family. We used to visit his parents in Chicago at least twice a year and had regular video calls with them. Suddenly, those calls always seemed to happen when I was out of the house, and he started making solo trips to see them. When I expressed interest in joining him, there was always some reason why it wasn't a good time. The most telling instance was when he cancelled our Christmas trip to his parents' home just 3 days before we were set to leave. He claimed his mother wasn't feeling well and didn't want guests. I later called his mum to send my well wishes, and she seemed perfectly fine, even confused about why I was asking about her health. Our connection began changing too. We had always been physically and emotionally close, but James started working later, initiating intimacy less and sharing fewer details about his day. Conversations that once flowed easily became surface-level exchanges about household matters and schedules. It was Amanda who first verbalized what I had been feeling. During a quick lunch together, she asked if everything was okay between James and me. When I asked why she was concerned, she mentioned that Tim had noticed James acting strangely at our last couples gathering, checking his phone constantly and seeming distant. Amanda gently pointed out other patterns she'd observed that I'd been too close to see clearly. Despite these growing concerns, I kept making excuses for him. Maybe he was under stress at work. Maybe he was planning something special. Maybe he was dealing with something personal he wasn't ready to share. I didn't want to be the suspicious, nagging wife. I trusted him completely, or at least I wanted to. I started doubting myself, wondering if I was creating problems where none existed. Was I being paranoid? Overly sensitive? Was I looking for issues because of my own insecurities? I spent hours analyzing and reanalyzing his words and actions, trying to convince myself everything was fine. But as the inconsistencies piled up, I reached a turning point. I realized I was spending more energy trying to explain away evidence than he was spending to provide those explanations. Something wasn't adding up, and I decided it was time to pay attention to what was happening rather than what I wished was happening. That decision changed everything. I struggled with how to proceed. Part of me wanted to confront James directly with my suspicions, but I worried that without concrete evidence, he would dismiss my concerns, or worse, become more careful about hiding whatever was going on. I also genuinely respected our privacy and felt uncomfortable about investigating my own husband. After much internal debate, I decided to look deeper while trying to maintain some boundaries. I wasn't going to hack into his accounts or follow him, but I would pay closer attention to the information that was already available to me. The first significant clue came when I was unpacking his suitcase after a trip, something I often did to help out. Tucked into a side pocket was a second phone charger, different from the one he normally used. When I asked about it casually, he said he kept a spare for travel in case he lost one. It seemed reasonable enough, but I had never seen this charger before in 7 years of marriage. A few days later, while using his tablet to look up a recipe with his permission, I noticed a banking app I didn't recognize. It wasn't one we used for our joint accounts. When I opened it, it requested a password. I didn't try to guess it, but made a mental note of the bank's name, a credit union based in Arizona. James's frequent trips to Phoenix became my focus. He had mentioned working with a client called Western Regional Distribution, so I searched for information about this company. I found their website and locations, but none in Phoenix. When I casually mentioned this to James, he quickly explained they were opening a new location there. But I couldn't find any news or announcements about such an expansion. An opportunity presented itself when James left his laptop open while taking a shower. His email was open, and while I hadn't planned to snoop, a folder labeled Phoenix caught my eye. I clicked on it and found a separate email account was logged in, one I had never seen before, with dozens of emails about property maintenance, school enrollment, and community events in a Phoenix suburb. I felt sick to my stomach, but continued looking. Before James returned, I discovered hotel reservations that clearly showed bookings for 2 adults. Despite his insistence, these were solo business trips. I quickly closed everything and tried to act normal when he came back, but my mind was racing. I spent the next day searching social media for any trace of James in Phoenix, but found nothing suspicious. His accounts showed exactly what I would expect: occasional posts about business trips, our life together, and interactions with friends we both knew. If he had another life, he was keeping it completely separate from his digital footprint. I decided to take a calculated risk and called James's assistant at work, whom I had met at company events. I pretended I needed to send something important to James and wanted to confirm which hotel he was staying at in Phoenix. She seemed confused and mentioned he wasn't at a hotel but was dealing with a family emergency at home in Scottsdale this trip. We had no family in Scottsdale. When I thanked her and hung up, my hands were shaking. The next time James mentioned an upcoming Phoenix trip, I suggested joining him for the weekend part, saying I could use a change of scenery. His reaction was immediate and intense. He became nervous, making excuses about how busy he would be and how it wouldn't be any fun for me. When I pressed, he claimed the client was going through sensitive reorganization, and having a spouse present would be inappropriate. I pretended to understand, but his panic was confirmation something was very wrong. One evening, while we were watching TV on the couch, a text notification flashed on his phone screen before he could grab it. I caught only a glimpse, but the words, "Our anniversary," were clearly visible. Our anniversary was months away, and the text wasn't from a number saved in his contacts. As weeks passed and my suspicions grew, I began experiencing physical symptoms of stress. I lost weight, had trouble sleeping, and developed persistent headaches. I found myself jumping every time James's phone rang and analysing every word he said for inconsistencies. Our home, once my sanctuary, began to feel like a stage set for a performance I hadn't realised I was part of. I finally broke down and confided in my sister Lisa. She was shocked but practical, suggesting I needed to confront James directly. "Just ask him," she said. "Look him in the eye and ask if there's something he needs to tell you." But I knew that without evidence, any conversation would just be my suspicions against his denials, and I had already seen how easily he could make me doubt myself. After 3 weeks of gathering concerning but inconclusive evidence, I made a decision I never imagined I would make in my marriage. I hired a private investigator with experience in infidelity cases. It was expensive and felt like a betrayal of trust, but I needed to know the truth. The investigator promised to be discreet and to focus only on James's time in Phoenix. I felt both relief at taking action and shame at having reached this point in my marriage. 2 weeks after hiring the private investigator, I received an email with a subject line that simply read, "Initial findings." I was alone in our house sitting at the kitchen island, where James and I had shared countless meals and conversations. My hands trembled as I opened the attachment. The first image showed James entering a restaurant with a woman I had never seen before. They were holding hands, his fingers intertwined with hers in a gesture of familiar intimacy. She was attractive with shoulder-length blonde hair, and she was looking at him exactly the way I used to, with complete adoration. The timestamp showed this was during his last supposed business trip. More photos followed James and this woman shopping together, entering a movie theater, and most damning of all, kissing outside what appeared to be a residential home in a nice suburban neighborhood. The investigators' notes were clinical and devastating. Subject observed at residential address 1542 Saguaro Lane, Scottsdale. Property records indicate purchase date 3 years ago, joint ownership under names James Wilson and Natalie Parker. I sat there for hours going through every image and note. I didn't cry. I felt hollow, like everything inside me had been scooped out. This wasn't just an affair. The level of establishment suggested something much more permanent. The next day, while James was at work, I did something I had never done before. I searched through his closet, looking in pockets and bags he rarely used. In a duffel bag pushed to the back of his closet shelf, I found a small velvet box containing a wedding ring that wasn't mine. A simple gold band that looked well worn. With shaking hands, I turned to his cloud storage accounts. We shared most of our digital photos, but I remembered he had mentioned having a separate backup for work documents. I had the password written down in our home information folder. What I found wasn't work documents at all, but photos. Hundreds of them, of James with the blonde woman from the investigators' photos. And there were wedding photos. A different ceremony than ours, smaller, and in what looked like someone's backyard, but unmistakably a wedding with James as the groom and this woman, Natalie, as the bride. The timestamps on these photos showed they were taken 5 years ago, 2 years after our own wedding. My husband had married another woman while being married to me. The reality of it was so absurd, I almost laughed through my tears. But the most shocking discovery came when I found photos of a child, a little boy around 4 years old who had James's smile and eyes. There were pictures of James holding this child as a newborn birthday celebrations, Christmas mornings, all the family moments we had been trying to create together. I found a digital copy of a birth certificate for a boy named Ethan James Wilson, born 4 years ago to parents James Wilson and Natalie Parker Wilson. The timeline hit me like a physical blow. This child had been conceived and born while James and I were actively trying to have our own baby. While I had been crying over negative pregnancy tests, he had been starting another family in another state. I dug deeper and found credit card statements showing mortgage payments on the Scottsdale property, utility bills, preschool tuition payments. James had been maintaining an entire separate household while sharing our life in Portland. The photos were the hardest to look at. An entire family album showing holidays, vacations, and everyday moments. Natalie and James looked happy together, just as James and I had been. There were photos of them with friends I'd never met, gatherings with her family, and even a picture of them with his parents, the same parents who had welcomed me as their daughter-in-law. I went down a research rabbit hole, finding property records online, confirming that James and Natalie jointly owned the home in Scottsdale, purchased 5 years ago. He had a second home, a second life, a second everything, all while maintaining our life together without a hint of the truth. The emotional impact hit me in waves. One moment I was numb, methodically gathering evidence, and the next I was on the bathroom floor sobbing uncontrollably. I vomited several times that day, my body physically rejecting the truth my mind was struggling to process. I didn't go to work. I didn't call anyone. I just moved through our house like a ghost, looking at our photos on the walls with new eyes, wondering which life was the real one and which was the lie. Or were they both lies? The most crushing realization came when I found evidence that some of James's work colleagues knew about both families. In one photo at what appeared to be a company event in Phoenix, I recognized his boss standing next to James and Natalie. These people had met me at similar events in Portland. They had participated in his deception, smiling to my face, while knowing he went home to another wife when in Arizona. Even more painful was the evidence that his parents were fully aware of his double life. There were photos of them holding baby Ethan, celebrating holidays with James and Natalie. The same parents who sent me birthday cards and called me their daughter had accepted another woman in exactly the same role. Every relationship I thought I had with his family was based on lies. The horror continued when I found anniversary cards in his email drafts. He had sent almost identical messages to both Natalie and me on our respective anniversaries, changing only our names and specific references. The personal, intimate words I had treasured as unique to our relationship had been copied and pasted for his other wife. This discovery triggered a complete identity crisis. I began questioning every moment of our relationship, every conversation, every plan we had made. Had any of it been real? Did he actually love either of us? Or were we both just convenient arrangements in different cities? Who was the real James? And had I ever actually known him at all, I felt like I was losing my grip on reality, questioning my own memories and perceptions. I spent 3 days in this state, gathering evidence, falling apart, pulling myself together to look for more information, then collapsing again under the weight of each new discovery. I didn't eat, barely slept, and spoke to no one. I needed to understand the full scope of his deception before I could share it with anyone else. By the end of those 3 days, I had compiled an extensive digital folder documenting James's double life, and I was ready to confront the stranger I had been married to for 7 years. I knew the confrontation with James needed to be handled strategically. Despite my emotional devastation, I forced myself to think clearly about how to approach this impossible conversation. I didn't want to give him a chance to create more lies or manipulate me further. I decided to confront him at home rather than in a public place. I needed the privacy to express my raw emotions, and I wanted him to face the evidence in the space where we had built our life together, the life he had betrayed so completely. I chose a Saturday morning when he had no plans to leave the house, ensuring we would have uninterrupted time. In preparation, I made copies of all the evidence and stored them in multiple secure locations. With my sister in a new email account he couldn't access and on an external hard drive hidden at my office. I also consulted briefly with a divorce attorney to understand my legal options, though I didn't file any paperwork yet. I transferred half of our joint savings into an individual account in my name only, not to hide money from eventual divorce proceedings, but to ensure I would have financial resources regardless of how James reacted. The day before the confrontation, I prepared our house like I was staging it for one final scene. I printed key photos and documents and arranged them in chronological order on our dining table. I packed an overnight bag and left it in my car trunk, unsure if I would want to stay in our house after everything was out in the open. When Saturday morning arrived, I felt strangely calm. James was making coffee in the kitchen, talking about plans to try a new hiking trail the next day. I watched him move around our home, so comfortable in his lies. I waited until he sat down with his coffee, then simply said, "We need to talk about Natalie and Ethan." The change in his expression was immediate and unmistakable. First confusion, then shock, followed by a flash of panic before he attempted to compose himself. "Who?" he asked, but his voice cracked on the single word. His hands gripped his coffee mug so tightly I thought it might shatter. "Your wife and son in Scottsdale," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "I know everything, James." He attempted denial at first, claiming he didn't know what I was talking about, but his performance lacked conviction. I silently stood up and led him to the dining room, where the evidence was displayed. As he took in the photos, documents, and timeline I had created, the color drained from his face. He sat down heavily, still not speaking. I pushed further. "How long did you think you could keep this up? Were you ever going to tell either of us, or were you planning to live this lie forever?" His initial response was pathetic. "I can explain," he said, though it was clear from his expression that he knew no explanation could possibly suffice. When I remained silent waiting, he began a halting confession. He admitted everything: the second marriage, the child, the double life maintained for years. As he spoke, I realized he had created elaborate systems to keep his two lives separate: different credit cards, separate email accounts, carefully managed schedules, and the complicity of friends and family who helped maintain his deception. His justification was both predictable and infuriating. "I love you both," he said, tears in his eyes. "It started as a business relationship with Natalie, but it became more. I couldn't bear to hurt either of you by choosing. I thought I could make it work." "Make it work," I repeated incredulously. "You've been lying to both of us for years. You've stolen our ability to make informed choices about our own lives. You've implicated everyone around you in your lies." The most shocking revelation came when he admitted that Natalie had no idea about me either. She believed she was his only wife, just as I had. They had met during one of his earliest business trips to Arizona, and he had pursued a relationship with her while already married to me. He had told her that he was based in Portland, but traveled for work, which explained his absences from their home in Scottsdale. I felt a strange connection to this woman I had never met, both of us victims of the same elaborate deception. In that moment, I made a decision that James clearly never expected. I'm going to contact Natalie, I told him. She deserves to know the truth as much as I did. The panic on his face intensified. Please don't, he begged. Let me talk to her. I can explain it to her in a way that won't be so devastating. The way you explained it to me, I asked coldly. No, you've had years to tell the truth and you chose not to. You don't get to control the narrative anymore. I had already found Natalie's contact information in my investigation. While James watched, I sent her a text. This is Chloe Wilson James's wife from Portland. I've recently discovered our husband's double life, and I think we should talk. I have evidence I can share with you. She responded within minutes, clearly confused and distressed. After a brief exchange, confirming that neither of us was playing some cruel joke, we arranged to speak by phone later that day. James sat there the entire time, his head in his hands, occasionally making desperate pleas that both of us ignored. The conversation with Natalie was surreal. We started as wary strangers, each suspicious that the other might be lying. But as we shared details only a wife would know, his morning routine, the scar on his shoulder, his favourite foods, the terrible truth became undeniable for both of us. Our initial shock and disbelief turned to shared anger. By the end of that hour-long call, we had formed an unlikely alliance against the man who had betrayed us both. In the days that followed, James's elaborate deception continued to unravel. His parents called begging me to forgive their son. It became clear they had known about both marriages and had chosen to participate in his lies, rather than challenge him or warn either of us. Friends admitted they had suspected something wasn't right, but hadn't wanted to get involved. Colleagues confessed they had been uncomfortable with the situation, but felt it wasn't their place to interfere. The financial implications were even more complex than I had initially understood. Beyond the two households, James had hidden accounts and investments neither Natalie nor I knew about. He had been systematically moving money around, creating a financial web so complicated it would take forensic accountants to fully unravel it. I filed for divorce the following Monday. The paperwork felt inadequate to address the magnitude of his deception, but it was a necessary first step in legally severing my connection to a man I now realized I had never really known. I couldn't bear to stay in our house. Every corner held memories now tainted by lies. I packed essential items and moved into my sister's guest house temporarily. As I sorted through my belongings, deciding what to take and what to leave behind, I felt like I was excavating artifacts from a life that had never really existed. Our social circle fractured in the aftermath. Some friends stood firmly by me, offering support and expressing outrage on my behalf. Others seemed uncertain how to react, uncomfortable with the messy reality of our situation. A few even suggested I should have been more attentive, more aware of the signs, as if his elaborate deception was somehow partly my responsibility. These fair-weather friends quickly fell away, and I was surprised to find I didn't miss them. The legal process of divorcing a man with 2 wives and hidden financial assets proved to be extraordinarily complicated. I hired Catherine Blakely, an attorney who specialised in high-conflict divorces involving financial fraud. When I showed her the evidence I had gathered, she actually gasped. In 15 years of practice, she said, I've never seen a case quite like this. Catherine immediately filed for an emergency hearing to freeze James's assets and prevent him from hiding more money or property. She also coordinated with Natalie's attorney in Arizona to strengthen both our cases. Since James had legally married me first, my marriage was valid, while his marriage to Natalie was technically bigamous. This gave me certain legal advantages, but also meant Natalie faced additional challenges in securing her rights and those of her son. James hired an aggressive attorney who immediately employed intimidation tactics. They sent threatening letters suggesting I would be financially ruined if I pursued certain claims. They implied I must have known about the second family and had tacitly accepted the arrangement. They even suggested I had hidden assets of my own, a laughable claim given that James had controlled most of our finances. The case inevitably attracted media attention when it entered the public record. A local news outlet picked up the story, and within days I was receiving calls from reporters and even national tabloid shows. I declined all interviews, but that didn't stop articles from appearing with sensational headlines like Portland Realtor uncovers husband's secret family and Double Life Divorce rocks local business community. The unwanted publicity was excruciating. Strangers gave me pitying looks at the grocery store. Real estate clients asked if I was that poor woman from the news. Some people seemed almost excited to be adjacent to such a scandal, while others clearly judged me for not having discovered the deception sooner. I felt like I was living in a fishbowl, my private pain on display for public consumption. Surprisingly, I received support from unexpected quarters. Several of James's colleagues reached out to express their disgust with his actions and to offer information about his business dealings that proved valuable to my case. One woman who worked in his company's accounting department confidentially shared records showing he had been misclassifying personal expenses as business costs for years, information that would later be crucial in the financial settlement. As the investigation deepened, we discovered James's deception extended beyond just Natalie and me. There were at least 2 other women he had been involved with during business trips to Seattle and Denver. While these relationships appeared less established than his 2 marriages, they demonstrated a pattern of calculated dishonesty that was breathtaking in its scope. The forensic accountant Catherine hired found evidence of financial manipulation dating back to the earliest days of our marriage. James had been systematically diverting funds into hidden accounts, creating shell companies to hide assets, and maintaining separate credit profiles in different states. The level of premeditation required for this financial shell game suggested he had been planning his double life from the very beginning. During discovery, we learnt James had been actively hiding assets in anticipation of eventually being caught. He had purchased cryptocurrency, invested in a friend's business under a different name, and even bought gold coins that were stored in a safety deposit box we hadn't known existed. Each new discovery felt like a fresh betrayal, a reminder that the man I thought I knew had never actually existed. My credit score and financial reputation suffered collateral damage in the process. Several loans and credit cards I thought were in good standing turned out to have missed payments when James started prioritizing his other household's finances over ours. Accounts I didn't even know existed had been opened in my name and then neglected. Repairing this damage would take years. 6 months after the initial discovery, we finally had our day in court. I was terrified about facing James and worried about how I would handle the stress of testifying. But when the moment came, I found strength I didn't know I possessed. I told our story clearly and factually, presenting the evidence of his deception without embellishment. The truth was damning enough without emotional flourishes. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, listened attentively and asked pointed questions that suggested she understood exactly what James had done. When James testified, attempting to portray himself as a confused man who had found himself in an impossible situation, through a series of poor choices rather than calculated deception, the judge's skeptical expression made it clear she wasn't buying his narrative. The court's ruling exceeded my expectations. The judge granted me a favorable division of assets, including compensation for the financial damage to my credit history and additional damages for the fraud James had perpetrated. She also made several scathing comments about his systematic and calculated deception of 2 families and his profound breach of the most fundamental marital trust. Throughout this period, I had avoided social media, entirely afraid of the public scrutiny and judgment. But after the court ruling, I decided to reclaim my narrative. I made a single carefully worded post explaining that I had been through a difficult divorce involving deception, thanking those who had supported me, and asking for privacy as I rebuilt my life. The outpouring of support was overwhelming. Messages from friends, colleagues, clients, and even strangers who had experienced betrayal in their own relationships. After nearly 8 months of legal battles, the divorce was finally finalized. I received the notification while at work and immediately stepped outside to call my sister. As I shared the news, I was surprised to find myself crying, not from sadness, but from relief. The legal ties to James were officially severed. I was free to move forward. One of the most unexpected developments came the day after the divorce was finalized. I received a handwritten letter from James's mother. She expressed profound remorse for her role in the deception, explaining that she had initially believed James's claim that he and I were separated but maintaining appearances for his career. By the time she realized the full truth, she felt trapped in the lie. Her apology seemed genuine, but the breach of trust was too severe for me to respond. I filed the letter away, perhaps to revisit when the wounds weren't so fresh. The first weeks after the divorce was finalized were strangely anticlimactic. The legal battle had given me purpose and focus. Without it, I felt adrift in a life I no longer recognized. The trauma of James's betrayal manifested in unexpected ways. I developed severe insomnia, jumping at every sound in the night. I found myself checking and rechecking facts people told me, unable to simply accept information at face value. I questioned my own judgment constantly. How could I have been so completely deceived by someone I thought I knew intimately? I finally accepted my sister's suggestion to start therapy. My therapist, Dr. Meredith, specialized in betrayal trauma, and understood the unique pain of discovering your entire reality had been constructed on lies. She helped me see that my inability to detect James's deception wasn't a failure of intelligence or intuition. It was a testament to the elaborate nature of his fraud and the natural trust that exists in intimate relationships. "You weren't stupid for trusting your husband," she told me during one particularly difficult session. "He was wrong for making trust impossible." Those words became a mantra for me in the months that followed. I wasn't stupid for trusting. He was wrong for breaking that trust. Slowly, I began reconnecting with friends I had neglected during my marriage and the divorce process. I was surprised to discover how many relationships had been strained during my years with James. He had subtly isolated me from people who were too perceptive or asked too many questions. Another red flag I had missed. Rebuilding these connections became an important part of my healing. After 6 months in my sister's guest house, I was ready for a place of my own. I found a small but bright apartment in a different neighborhood from where James and I had lived. It was nothing like our carefully decorated home. It was smaller, less prestigious, and completely mine. I furnished it sparsely at first, taking time to consider each addition rather than rushing to fill the space. Every item I chose reflected my taste alone, with no compromises or considerations for anyone else's preferences. One of the most unexpected developments in my recovery was my evolving relationship with Natalie. What had begun as an alliance of necessity during the divorce proceedings gradually transformed into a genuine connection. We spoke regularly, comparing notes on our healing journeys and supporting each other through difficult milestones. She faced additional challenges I didn't, explaining the situation to Ethan in age-appropriate ways, managing co-parenting with a man neither of us trusted, but we found common ground in our shared experience of betrayal and recovery. My career had suffered during the divorce process, with my emotional state making it difficult to maintain the positive, confident demeanor necessary for real estate success. I decided to use this as an opportunity to reevaluate my professional path. I took courses in commercial real estate, an area I had always been interested in but had never explored. The challenge of learning new skills and building a different client base gave me purpose and helped rebuild my self-confidence. A pivotal moment in my healing came during a weekend women's retreat in the mountains. Surrounded by strangers who knew nothing of my story, I found myself laughing genuinely for the first time in over a year. During a hiking excursion, I reached the summit of a challenging trail and felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment and freedom. Standing there, looking out over the vast landscape, I realized I was no longer defining myself by what had happened to me. I was simply Chloe again, bruised but whole, wiser but not bitter. Dating again seemed impossible at first. The idea of being vulnerable with someone new terrified me. Dr. Meredith encouraged me to take small steps. Coffee dates with no expectations, clear boundaries, and honest communication about my past. My first few attempts were awkward and uncomfortable, but eventually I met Michael, a divorced architect, who understood the complexity of rebuilding after betrayal. Our relationship developed slowly, with careful attention to transparency and trust. I didn't know if it would last, but the experience of connecting authentically with someone new was healing in itself. One of the most helpful resources in my recovery was a support group for people who had experienced relationships with pathological liars and manipulators. Hearing others' stories helped me recognize patterns in James's behavior that I hadn't been able to name before. The group taught me about concepts like gaslighting and love bombing that explained so much about how James had been able to maintain his deception for so long. With this new understanding, I could look back and recognize red flags I had missed, how James deflected questions about inconsistencies, how he isolated me from people who might notice problems, how he created drama to distract from suspicious behavior. These insights didn't change what had happened, but they armed me against similar deceptions in the future. I made a deliberate decision to help others by sharing my experience. I started a blog anonymously writing about healing after betrayal without revealing the specific details of my situation. To my surprise, it attracted readers from around the country, many of whom shared similar experiences. Creating community around this painful experience transformed it from merely personal trauma into something meaningful that could help others. Financial independence became another cornerstone of my rebuilding process. I worked with a financial advisor to create a solid foundation for myself, learning about investments and retirement planning, topics James had always handled. Taking control of my financial future was empowering and helped restore my sense of security. I also focused on creating new traditions and rituals to replace those that had been tainted by my marriage. I started celebrating the anniversary of my divorce with a day of self-care and reflection. I established Friday night dinners with friends, Sunday morning hikes, and quarterly weekend trips to explore new places. These routines gave structure to my new life and created positive associations to replace painful memories. The most profound change was in my relationship with solitude. What had once been a terrifying emptiness gradually transformed into peaceful independence. I learned to enjoy my own company, to trust my thoughts and feelings, and to recognize my own worth independent of any relationship. Being alone was no longer something I feared, but something I sometimes actively chose. It's been 2 years since I discovered James's double life. I won't pretend the pain is completely gone. There are still moments when a memory ambushes me or when trust feels impossibly difficult. But those moments grow less frequent and less intense with time. The betrayal is a part of my story now, but it's no longer the defining chapter. What I've learned through this experience is that trust isn't naive. It's necessary for meaningful connection. The alternative, perpetual suspicion, would make genuine intimacy impossible. I've learnt that forgiveness isn't about excusing what happened, but about freeing myself from the burden of anger. I've forgiven James not for his sake, but for mine. I've also learnt that we can rebuild from even the most devastating betrayals. The life I have now isn't the one I planned, but it's authentic in a way my marriage never was. Every relationship, every success, every moment of joy in my current life is built on truth rather than comfortable illusions. I don't know what the future holds. Maybe I'll marry again someday, or maybe I'll find fulfillment in my career and the family I've created from friends and chosen connections. What I do know is that whatever comes next will be on my terms, with my eyes open and with the hard-won wisdom that only comes from rebuilding yourself after everything falls apart. If you're watching this and you're in the midst of your own betrayal story, please know that the pain won't always be this acute. Trust yourself, surround yourself with supportive people who believe you, and take each day as it comes. Have you ever had to rebuild your life after discovering a devastating lie? Share your experience in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe to hear more stories of resilience and recovery. Thank you for listening to my journey from betrayal to healing. I hope it brings some comfort to know you're not alone in your struggles.